So my name's Rowan Mackenzie. You've probably seen more of me in the last 3 days than you maybe want to. The good news is that I'm co-chairing this panel with Erin Sullivan. So I'm going to hand over to Erin in a second to allow her to introduce herself. Welcome to the Global and Digital Shakespeares panel.
Lovely, thanks so much, Rowan. I think maybe if everyone just really quickly introduces themselves. I'll start by saying I'm Erin Sullivan. I'm a member of faculty at the Shakespeare Institute, colleagues with Michael and Rowan and Chris, and I'm really happy to be here talking about the intersections between digital and global Shakespeares. And I'm so grateful to our panel who brings so many different perspectives and so much expertise. So if you don't mind, I'll just call on you, and if you could say a quick hello and let people know who you are. Professor Alfredo Michel Modenesi.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I'm Alfredo Michel Modenesi from the National University of Mexico, where I teach translation and theater and sometimes whatever comes my way.
Wonderful, thank you. And Rob Miles.
Hi, I'm Rob Miles. I am a maker of Shakespeare, that is as an actor, director, and now dramaturg and coach. I'm also the artistic director of The Show Must Go Online, which began in early March 2020 as a way to keep actors and theatre makers connected and creative during COVID-19, but quickly blossomed to become a global movement, attracting 500 actors and creatives from 60 countries on 6 of the 7 continents.
Thank you so much. And Professor Sonia Masi.
Well, I'm a big fan of Rob, I should say, upfront. Thank you for keeping us going during the pandemic, Rob. I teach at King's College London, and one of my areas of research interest is global Shakespeare, and I've been thinking and giving one paper last December about the intersection between global and digital, something that's been somehow forced upon us, but also in many ways had already kind of started. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm just really keen to find out how everybody's thinking about the last 15 months and how we're looking forward to the foreseeable. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sonia. And finally, Michael Bartel.
Hi, everyone. I am so honored to be a part of this. I am Michael Bartel. I'm doing my PhD at the Shakespeare Institute at the moment, and my current research is all about the performance of emotion in various cultural contexts and in translation. So I'm really looking forward to learning as much as I can in the next 40 minutes.
Well, thank you. Well, I'll just really quickly say, because hopefully we have people joining this webinar from all different walks of life. So I want to quickly sort of gloss very quickly what we sort of are thinking about when we're talking about digital Shakespeares and global Shakespeares, and say that both have, it's certainly in academia, have a body of work, but also obviously in creative practice, which is usually what the academic studies are based on, are bustling and burgeoning areas. And then say digital Shakespeares typically refers to different kinds of Shakespearean performance that are enabled through digital technology. So sometimes created with it and through it, and also in some cases disseminated through it. So some people might include things like cinema broadcasts or online streams of productions, but also productions that perhaps use interesting forms of live video and projections and things like that. And then all different kinds of new forms that are evolving and have evolved, especially over this last year. And then with global Shakespeares, it's often a term that's used very broadly to refer to Shakespeare as performed around the world, often in languages other than English, but not exclusively. And thinking about how different forms of, different approaches to translation, linguistically, but also kind of different cultural adaptations and different ways of reading Shakespeare through different global cultures brings new meaning and new life to his plays. So I wanted to start off with a question for the quote unquote global Shakespeareans, although I think we're all really both. But I wanted to ask how digital technology has affected global Shakespearean performance from your point of view. And I know it's a broad question, so feel free to narrow it in whatever way you wish, maybe in whatever way interests you most. And I wonder, Sonia, if you wouldn't mind starting us off. I know you said that you've been thinking about this already in your work. Oh, sorry, Sonia, if you just unmute, thank you.
With pleasure. Thank you, Erin. I thought I'd just put across just a few points to stimulate the conversation, really, more than anything else. First of all, the last 15 months or so have, I think, brought to the fore questions, issues, opportunities that I think were already there. The pandemic has accelerated changes that were, I think, already underway, without wanting to minimize the disastrous impact that the pandemic has had on the theatre industry, of course. But just looking at how the industry has responded to the pandemic, I think the 3 points I'd like to take away from it for our discussion. One is that the way we were thinking about theatrical performance had already somehow anticipated the need to reconceptualize performance as something that doesn't have to be live. And there are 3 names that certainly have helped me kind of map out the progression from live to digital. Big names for people interested in a kind of theatre studies. So Peggy Fallon, 1993, writing about liveness in a very kind of ontological way, so that theatre performance needs to be live. Via Philip Auslander, 1999, arguing quite rightly that actually live is always and inevitably mediated. Up to 2013, Martin Barker, really interesting shift from liveness to aliveness. So moving on from the ontology of just being or not being somewhere to the experiential level of feeling that whether you're there or not there, there's something happening, and it's a feeling of being alive, connected, that matters. So it seems to me this was 2013. No one had predicted COVID back then, and so this idea that we can should reconceptualize what theatre is. That leads me to my second point, which is less to do with kind of how we want to conceptualize and theory and ways of thinking, and more practically about access. My hope certainly is that as we move on, we will not forget the lessons that we have learned under the terrible circumstances that we all had to grapple with, which is that a lot of people who were excluded from live performance were able to access theatre. And I think that's hugely important. And I hope that somehow this will be remembered and will affect practice. And with a note of optimism, this hope of mine was somehow became more of a possibility rather than just a hope when I attended a webinar, very much like this one. There were great directors on it. There was Thomas Tostemeyer, there was Ivo van Hove and Didier Deschamps. And this was 24th of November, so still in the, even before kind of the second massive peak of infections. And Thomas Ostermeyer was saying, we need to wait, of course, and while we wait, we broadcast, you know, whatever we got in our archives that we think will speak to people right now. And Ivo, I don't know if you know, I'm a huge fan of Ivo van Hove. Is smart because of what he does on stage, but also as he manages his ensemble in Amsterdam. And he said very simply, very quickly, he said, we've worked out that there is a perfectly viable economic model, that we can get a TV crew in the morning, They rehearse with the actors. 4 hours later, they are ready to stream. And so they I don't know if any of you have taken advantage of the kind of live streaming from Evo's Theater in Amsterdam. But that strikes me that they still had an empty theater. But you can imagine that they have socially distanced spectators in the theater physically while streaming. And that, to me, it's a fantastic kind of hybrid solution that would allow us to retain the level of access that digital theater has afforded, without obviously precluding actually looking forward to be physically back in the theaters.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sonia, for starting things off. I wonder if I could turn, Alfredo, to you to ask you about your experiences. I mean, you know, this year, you've worked as a translator of Shakespeare and in theatrical productions for a long time, but many people will have heard of your Romeo e Julieta that you did with the public theater. And I don't know if any of these questions about, you know, digital technology and global performance came up in discussions as you were thinking about who the audience might be or what you want to do. So feel free to answer with regard to that production, but equally, if you wanted to take things in a different direction, that's absolutely fine too.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there's so many things that Sonia, as usual, brings to the table and stimulates. I made some notes, but they're kind of sparse now. Anyway, it did, but there was something, shall we say, a bit in reverse. I was in New York City last week, as I told you, for several reasons, and one of them was I had a very nice talk, and for the first time, person to person, live with Sahim Ali, the great director of Romeo and Julieta, who proposed the project to me originally through Ayanna Thompson, I must say, and things came up, including, of course, that something I mean, we knew from the start that the project was originally to go live. I mean, he's directing for Shakespeare in the Park, and Shakespeare in the Park was probably the original idea with this. But then, of course, as we all know, something happened globally that started stopping us all from doing what we try and do and we like to do and we probably do best. And so, in a way, the transition from live to digital was just forced upon the project from the start. So it worked the other way around, so to speak, from some of the things that Sonia was saying. Then again, that was in some ways fortunate, because it put to the test some of those ideas and some of those premises that she was putting forth. And I think that it was pretty successful. Another way you can think of it, though, is that the reverse thing that I was talking about also worked for the medium itself, because if you think about it, it's a podcast, but it's really a podcast that resembles so much the old audio dramas. I mean, the audio dramas of old, with all the soundscapes in the great musical ambience that was created for the show, and a lot of what we learned is something that we had unlearned, so to speak. So there is that too, that you have to go back and realize that some of the things that we had supposed or that we had supposedly put aside or left behind or we had overcome with this or that technology were obsolete in the face of certain needs, and others had to be brought back to play. In the middle of all that, though, there was a fundamental question, which was precisely why try and do something in two languages at the same time. And the idea, curiously, was not the first. I mean, the idea for Romeo and Julieta with the New York Public Theater was not the first to be proposed to me. I had already, and only months before that, made an adaptation in a bilingual manner as well, though in this case, with the languages really belonging on either side of the conflict, with a colleague from the University of Texas San Marcos, who had the idea to make the Capulets a Mexican family still residing in Texas once Texas became independent from Mexico, and the Montagues being part of the American or the Anglo population that remained there during the Texan Republic. But looks like global and money, they do go together like bees and honey, I'd say, because that project really is there. We had a digital performance with troupe from Florida, but that was very limited. There were no resources really to make it and so on and so forth. While of course the New York Public Theater, with its wonderful prestige, its tremendous tradition, and everything behind it, afforded even an Oscar-winning performer to play the role of Juliet or Julieta. So that is, to me, and from the perspective of this place where I live, where I work, where I do everything I do, the central problem of everything that we propose to do with either global or digital, where we get and how we get the finance, and how we can indeed manage to put it then in the eyes of everybody we want to reach, in particular with something like Romeo y Julieta, whose origin is precisely in the fact that the mindscape, shall we say, of the United States is changing so rapidly with regard to the growth of the Spanish-speaking population. That's that was the foundation of the project, and I assume that just from my own experience of having two Romeo and Juliets, bilingual Romeo and Juliets, so close together, one in a very modest way and the other with such a fantastic support around it, are just the initial examples of something that may be just ready to pop up everywhere in such a diverse and extraordinarily complex society as the United States. That's what I could say, I think, just for opening remarks.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I mean, both you and Sonia have brought up so many important and rich points, big points about liveness, access, hybridity. Sonia was bringing up, and Alfredo, the relationship between what is perceived as new, but also, in some ways having many continuities with, or even returns to older or traditional forms. And also, of course, the really important point you bring up about the relationship between prestige and visibility, that as we have, access to more work, it doesn't necessarily mean that all works are equally visible to people. So perhaps that, we'll see where the conversation goes, but these might be things we return to. Mike,
if I may just add something very quickly, because I forgot to do it, and it is important. Some of you maybe in the audience, I don't remember, but I think Sonia couldn't do it that time, may have seen in London a performance of a wonderful adaptation, Mexican adaptation of Macbeth called Mendoza, which was received fantastically well in London and all over the world, by the way. I mean, it is a major production based on Shakespeare's Macbeth. One way that the pandemic affected, for example, the company that creates these wonderful adaptations is that they have two projects that have been completely stopped. I mean, they're ongoing in the sense that they're still working on them and so on and so forth. We are, because I am one of the people who advised them in their projects. Los Colochos is the company. But in the situation that you find in a country like mine, it is pretty hard to bring this even to the transformation into a digital project. There's simply been no way of doing it, and it's something that's, in my opinion, missing. while before the pandemic, they were able to move around and show their fantastic workplaces, like I say, London about 4 years ago or a little more. This has stopped dead. And we're kind of just in an impasse, waiting to see what can be done with that in the future.
Thank you. Michael, I wonder if I could turn to you and ask how some of these issues might, how they might bear on your research. I mean, I know that in a lot of ways your research plans were disrupted and changed by everything that's happened this year. On the other hand, there are certain ways in which kind of moves to digital have enabled certain things that you've been looking at. So I just wondered if you would mind coming in and sharing your thoughts too.
Absolutely. Yeah, my plan when I designed this research project was that I was going to be going all around Europe and seeing Shakespeare in theaters, and that has not been able to happen. But you know, it's been wonderful because, and connected to both Professor Modenesi's and Professor Masi's remarks, and their remarks about things like his own work, Romeo y Julieta, and with Mendoza, and with works from Thomas Ostermeyer and Ivo van Hove, that these productions are kind of emblematic of what I think has been an open secret amongst Shakespeareans for a long time, which is that Shakespeare's works these days are often much more exciting in other languages than they are in English. And I don't mind, as the first native English speaker, to to be the one to say that. But I have found that to be true for a long time. And the fact that over the course of the pandemic, these kinds of productions have become much more accessible for people who might not get to see them, might not get to travel and see them, or might not have the opportunity to see traveling companies to come in and see these kinds of things. It has been really eye-opening for a lot of people. I mean, has been really quite convenient for me as well, in terms of a lot of the things that I might not have been able to see or would have been very difficult for me to have access to have just happened to stream and receive premieres on Facebook or YouTube or what have you. And I can sit and watch them from the comfort of my own home, and I can rewind them for moments that I might have missed if I had not, if I weren't watching them on a screen. But the other thing that I found really fascinating is the fact that, you know, also connecting to the idea of aliveness is, I remember watching the premiere of a streaming of the Comédie Française production of The Tempest, and being on Twitter for that sort of that launch party, and having conversations with people in other countries about the differences between French verse speaking in Shakespearean theater versus English verse speaking. And as a verse nerd in particular, I mean, that was like, this kind of thing would never happen if it weren't for this particular circumstance. So I was really grateful for that. But I think from my own research perspective, it's been really fascinating, because the thing that I've been finding in my research is that, you know, looking at emotions, looking at the performance of emotions, this is something that's really dependent on a cultural context and sometimes on a historical context. And having emotions mediated through the screen is something that is, well, it's very different, you know, as I've been an actor for most of my life as well. And, you know, we all know that acting and performing emotions in cinema or in television is a very different thing from doing it on a stage when you're sharing it with a live audience who's there in person with you. And so looking at a medium that is meant to be experienced in the same physical space, and watching and observing the emotional differences between, you know, a Russian production of Measure for Measure versus an English one, it does become a little bit more obvious, because the camera makes it even more obvious than it would be if it were a film or a piece of, you know, a television. But another thing that it does is it sort of, I wonder, for people who aren't specifically looking at these productions for the differences in emotions as I am, is I wonder if it kind of makes certain things more kind of alienating, because of the fact that I have seen a lot of people remark like, oh gosh, the emotional tone of this production of The Winter's Tale, for example, is so different than I've ever seen it in an English speaking production. Is it, how does that get consumed? Is it alienating? Is it something that is, I think it sometimes becomes more compelling, but it is something that a difference that is there via a screen that wouldn't really be there for people who are more engaged with that culture, sitting in the theater, in the physical space where it was originally intended to be done. But that's, I think, speaking more to theater pieces that have been filmed before and were originally intended to be done in 3D, so to speak. Not so much the more digitized, more Zoom orientated experiences that we've been lucky to get used to lately. But yeah, these are kinds of the things that are swimming around in my head because of everything that we've been through.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. And that's a wonderful transition to inviting Rob into the conversation. Rob, I've classed you in my notes as a digital Shakespearean, but you're clearly also a global Shakespearean. But I wanted to ask you the ways in which you feel that digital Shakespearean performances are global, or equally, if there's something that's already come up in the conversation that you're more interested in, you can go with that.
Only about 15, but I'll start with what you've suggested, and I'll try and very quickly just knock off some responses to some of the points that have already been raised, just because I think as a maker and a doer of this, there's definitely things that kind of chime really excitingly. I've seen valid challenges about the differentiation between liveness and embodied work. There is liveness in digital work. The stuff that we were creating was live in that the audience were watching it at the same time as the actors were doing it. So it is still live, it's just a liveness of a different form. And that point that Sonia made about in 2013, the global community coming together, feeling connected, that's something that we saw incredibly palpably, and that the points about accessibility in particular were things that we found wonderful in terms of unintended consequence. So we had autistic audience members that were able, through the flatness of the medium, to interact with the work without getting the sensory overload that would traditionally accompany them in a theatre space. We had, incredibly movingly, someone in palliative care, the relative of a friend of one of the cast members who reported this story back to us, who actually spent their last night watching one of our productions live and interacting with that on the same terms as the rest of the audience who were watching that production. So this work matters, and it matters in ways that we didn't necessarily anticipate when we were making it. But lest we forget, disabled theatre artists have been pushing digital theatre hard, specifically because they've been excluded from these kind of venues. So I think there's big and exciting conversations to be had around digital theatre in that sense. In terms of the global nature of it, as I've already kind of name checked, we had actors from 60 countries on 6 of the 7 continents taking part in the shows over their lifespan, but they were all done in English. We had some second language speakers, and most recently, Kevin V. Smith's production of Marlowe's Edward II was a bilingual production in English and French. But these are still the languages of empire and of colonizers. And so there's still much more work to be done in our exploration of, I guess, Shakespeare through kind of focusing on the themes, I guess, as opposed to the text. Something that Shakespeare Ensemble, with their piece What You Will, did really well. They had actors in Japan, Europe, Canada, UK, US, India, all centering their work performing on the themes of Twelfth Night rather than on the actual kind of words themselves necessarily. So there's some really interesting stuff there. I'm just going through my notes here. Ostermeyer, we need to wait. No. What are you waiting for? We have, as Alfredo pointed out, no funding, no institutional support. We are not affiliated with any major producing house. Despite that, we have produced more original productions in response to the pandemic than all of them combined. This is a true testament to the power of passion and values-led practice when it comes to theatre makers from around the world coming together and unifying around Shakespeare and this work. You know, there are people out there from all around the world who want to take part in this, but there are key exclusions there that we need to examine as well, and that we're in the process of examining. In terms of live streaming, we are really interested, and without budget we'll never be able to do it, but we're already theorizing about how we can integrate creative technologies in creating immersive digital experiences for embodied work, and that kind of hybridizing, if you like. And I think there are much more interesting options available to us already right now with the technology that exists than the 3-camera static broadcast that we're getting at the minute. So yeah, I think there's some really interesting and cool stuff in that as well. Let's have a look. What is perceived as new, I thought was a really interesting talking point. You know, we used original process despite the fact that it was a digital thing. So we didn't use virtual backgrounds at any point because Shakespeare is a shared light, shared space experience. So you are in your living room and we are in ours, and there is a equanimity there between the actors and the audience. Again, trying to create that sense of shared experience however we can. Transforming productions to digital, a missing link in overcoming limitations on touring, I think is absolutely fascinating, and that's something that we'd love to talk to companies about if that's something that they would love to do, because we've already supported, I think, about 15 different companies and institutions with skill sharing about how we do the things that we do. So if people did want to adapt their work into that medium, that's something that we'd love to be able to help with. Obviously, all of ours are English-speaking productions. And I think Michael's point about non-English productions being far more interesting, I think, needs to necessarily make us ask heavy questions about what it is that we are stymied by. And I would offer that for my exploration and what I've discovered so far, it's largely to do with the legacy of Victorian cultural imperialism and the exclusion of certain groups that obviously necessitates. And that's something that we've been working hard to unpick through the kind of choices that we've been making, both in our practice and our process and our policy as well. Finally, I think there was a lovely thing about the emotion being mediated through Zoom. The elasticity of that medium to me is fascinating. The fact that if you're on stage on your own, you are in an extreme close-up in which your head may be physically bigger than it is in real life, and you're having to do cinema acting, cinema scale acting. If you're in a large scale scene where there's 25 people on stage, you're the size of a postage stamp, and now you've got to play to the back of the room as if you were doing a stadium gig. So it's astonishing to see the elasticity of performance that's necessary through these pieces. I think that idea of there being native digital pieces that were authored for this purpose, is something that's really exciting. And I think it's something that has to continue rather than it just being a kind of afterthought for accessibility, if you like. I think the biggest lesson that we've learned is that involving all audiences on the same terms is something to really aspire to, and something that digital theatre can do in a way that's better than most other mediums as they currently exist.
Thank you so much. Well, I have quite a lot of questions written down, but I'm also thinking that given the time, it might be good for me to go ahead and invite questions from the audience as well, because this is probably the best opportunity. So if people have questions, they're welcome to put them in the chat or the Q&A button. And I don't know, Rowan, if I could bring you in, because you wrote a couple of questions. Is there, as you're listening to the conversation, as someone who obviously has engaged with global and digital Shakespeares, but also might work in kind of adjacent areas, were there, of your questions, one that was sort of especially pressing for you that you were thinking about?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Fascinating to hear from all of you, and thank you for what you've shared so far. I think for me, the point that I keep coming back to is that obviously in a lot of ways, digital Shakespeare has made Shakespeare more accessible and more equitable for so many people across the globe, where there isn't the issue of price of tickets or travel or sitting in a theatre space when you're autistic, and that might be overwhelming and a sensory overload and so on. But I'm also really concerned about this issue of digital poverty, probably because a lot of the groups that I work with lots of people who are often on the fringes of society, and therefore digital poverty is a reality. So I guess I'm just interested in people's thoughts around how we tackle that, and can we tackle that? And actually, you know, what do we do? Because we want to bridge those divides, not widen them.
Yeah,
if anyone
important.
That.
I'll just say quickly, as maybe people formulate their thoughts, because I think others might have ideas as well. It's something that was really interesting to me with the RSC's Dream project that came out in March. I felt like there was a strong, I suppose, tension there really between the desire to test the kind of, you know, so-called cutting or even bleeding edge of technology. What can you do with different kinds of virtual reality work and mixed media work? But also questions about, but how can it also be as accessible as possible, and how can it work on a phone? And it, you know, you don't need to buy really expensive kit. Not to say that a phone is inconsequential in terms of cost, but thinking about that. And I think that project, which was very high profile, illuminated a lot of those challenges and difficulties of how do you do both at the same time. And I'm not really sure from a creative practitioner point of view how you do it, or if it's possible, if you need to kind of focus on one or the other and wait until gradually the two meet in the middle. I don't know, other people might think.
I'm going to be careful about how I phrase this, but I would say that as artists, we exist in a society, and advocacy is within our powers to do. And it's probably one of the only things that is within our power to do in terms of solving this issue. You know, global access to high quality broadband was a policy that was floated at one point here in the UK and was not voted in, if you like, but could have answered a lot of those challenges. I feel like in focusing on what we can do rather than what we can't, it's easy to say, well, I'm not in charge of the government, so I can't give everyone the internet that I wish they had. We can nevertheless, I guess, look at how the necessity of it for our work interrelates with the necessity of it for other people's survival, I guess, and the fact that they'll get the arts as a nice bonus within what is already a very necessary thing.
Yeah, and I would add that, you know, I think that this idea of digital poverty is kind of rests on a more fundamental bedrock of energy poverty that a lot of people experience. You know, you can't even think about accessing digital materials if you don't even have if you can't afford to pay the energy bills, or if you don't even have a light by which you can read a book. You know, I think. And there are institutions out there who are looking to and have made amazing progress actually on addressing energy poverty and on digital poverty. And I think that the more we can talk both as scholars and as artists and as just people in society about the need for that, because I think a lot of people don't realize how massive a problem even energy poverty is. The more we can talk about that, the more we can bring that to the, you know, to the forefront of people's minds. I think the better. I think that Rob is absolutely right that we can and need to advocate for that as publicly as we possibly can.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. Both make really good points, and I think it is. I know it's not something we're going to be able to solve today, but I think it's something that very much I would like to see Shakespeare Beyond Borders and all of the artists and the academics and the practitioners and the participants that are engaged in this. We're here because we care. And I think we need to keep pushing those difficult questions and those difficult conversations, because things do need to change. And I think we all know that. And hopefully that's something that we can, you know, make some influence over. Just very, very conscious of time. These panels, I'm sure, eat 40 minutes in way less time than we deserve them to do. And we all want to go on for at least another 40, I'm assuming. But unfortunately, I know we do need to draw it to a close. So from my point of view, it's been a real privilege to get to speak with yourselves as panelists. Some amazing conversations going on in the chat, and such a pity we don't have time to pick those up. Are there any final words from yourself, Erin, as co-chair for the panel?
Just to thank everyone, and maybe also to say with this the final question about access, perhaps in certain ways, digital performance is making us making some of these questions more visible, because as people are saying in the chat, there's lots of different kinds of performance that have been hugely inaccessible for a long time, but perhaps because it's making us realize we have a false assumption that because something's online, maybe that means everyone can watch it, and it's not the case, and it hasn't been the case. So perhaps, you know, that is one of the big benefits that it's making us more aware of, and this of course is happening in online teaching as well, more aware of of areas that people weren't thinking about before, and hopefully that visibility will help these conversations move forward with them. Thank you so much, Rowan, and thank you so much to the panel. And hopefully we can keep discussing both online and off about all of these issues.